Welcome to the GXM podcast, where we explore news and topics around video game music and the intersection between the games and music industries. We aim to publish fortnightly, so please be sure to subscribe. Joining me, Tom Quillfeldt, is my co-host Mat Ombler. Matt, since last time we've seen each other in the flesh at the Game Music Festival in London, which had a sort of a host of different panels and two wonderful concerts, one for The Last of Us and one for Baldur's Gate 3. You had the pleasure of being there for most of the whole day. How did you find it?
I had the time of my life. Won the entire event, considering there was so much happening. Like you said, there were two concerts, not one, but two separate concerts. Yes, from the same promoter, but two separate concerts for two different IPs. You had all of these panels, all of these masterclasses, all taking places in various different areas and rooms of the South Bank Centre. So I think, one, shout out to Game Music Festival for actually pulling all of this off and their staff for genuinely coordinating things. Two, shout out to Decibel PR for coordinating so many journers, guests and influencers, because where I was sitting, I just seemed to be crammed into a corner of like journers, which was amazing because it was actually all people I'd been chatting to already. So we did that thing where it was like, we'll have to sit down now, I'll see you later. And then, hello again, sitting right behind me. But yeah, I thought it was absolutely amazing. We'll dive into the music in more detail, but I think overall impression. So you got there early with me, obviously, for the masterclass. When did you leave?
I was in rather a better state than you, I must say.
Oh God, yeah, I was so hungover.
And it was very nice, actually. Yeah, I got there for the Borislav Slavov, who's the Baldur's Gate 3 composer, his panel, and bumped into Dom Pepiat, who's a fantastic writer for The Guardian and other news outlets. Sadly, didn't get enough time to speak to him because it was just sort of constantly bumping into people. It was like, oh yeah, I know your stuff. Yeah, that's cool. So, the panels were good. They were perhaps a bit broad, I think. I think next time, if I were putting them together panels, I might narrow down a little bit what they were about, because they started off quite broad and intimidating, I think, for the speakers about how to exactly nail down the topics. But of course, Borislav is incredibly personable. He's really engaged with the audience, so it was a lot of fun, lots of laughter and stuff. So that was really good. And then there was the panel, the BAFTA panel on video game music in culture, which I thought was a bit too wide-ranging a topic, and I think they had trouble kind of actually speaking on that topic rather than just saying interesting things about their different perspectives on video game music, which was absolutely fine because there were three very engaging panelists, including Kevin Schultz from Black Screen Records, Andy Nathan, who's a journalist, and Jade, the video game composer. Sadly, I can't remember her last name, but yeah, what did you reckon?
The challenge of any video game music panel, I think, even when you're at a conference for just game composers or whatever else, there's so many branching topics within game music where you could go down an audio path, you can go down a music path, you can go down the cultural impact path, which is what BAFTA did, and I'm really glad they did take that route. But again, the cultural impact of video game music, that's something it's something that I think I've done a panel on before in the past, and it's something that I've pitched to do. And I think now that I've seen it, it's you kind of even need to niche down even more. Yeah. Because I think you want to go broad to encourage all of these different areas of discussion, but then obviously the challenge is with the cultural impact of video game music. I mean, if I was on that, I'd just be riffing about prog rock in the 90s, and it's really, do you know what I mean? And that could just be its own thing. So yeah, I think there's difficulties there of doing that.
We kind of ended up on topics like copyright and YouTube takedowns and things. It was very much preaching to the choir. The audience were there. Everybody in the audience loves video game music already. And so perhaps what would have been interesting from specifically the perspective of cultural impact is hearing from someone outside the video game industry. Instead of the NME gaming editor, hearing what the NME main editor, what their reflections are on video game music and how much it might be seeping into wider culture. But I was very grateful to the Game Music Festival people for gifting me a ticket to the Last of Us concert, which happened pretty much straight afterwards. And that was incredible. It was incredible because it was a mixture of music from the Last of Us series and then some songs, Gustavo Santaolalla songs. He was there, the main composer of The Last of Us. He was on stage the whole time with his incredibly talented guitar assistant as well, or secondary guitarist, I must say. I got to find out who that guy's name is. They were brilliant, and Gustavo sang songs from other parts of his career, some music from the Motorcycle Diaries, which is his other sort of really big influential film soundtrack. And he's such a great entertainer, because at one point you could imagine people maybe starting to drift off a bit with a sort of very ambient, aleatoric, quite difficult to digest music, and then suddenly he was like, right, okay, let's belt one out, let's do like a barnstorming song. What did you reckon?
The drifting off thing, that was like literally my worry. So for some context and background, I came into this after going out for drinks the night before, where I think I had about 5 pints before moving on to sharing bottles of red. So I rocked up with like a terrible hangover on about 2 or 3 hours sleep, and I was just thinking, the fact I'm at a game music festival is, one, making this a lot more bearable, but two, if it's the music and melodies I'm already familiar with and they don't do anything different, there is that worry that I could just kind of drift off in the nicest way possible. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, that kept me. I was not expecting those songs, and I was not expecting those songs from a 72-year-old composer who walked onto the stage assisted. Do you know what I mean? Like, the man can riff, but I did not expect to hear him. I didn't know he could do that with his voice. Like, I did not know he could sing that well.
He's got a beautiful voice. And what do you reckon? Do you think Sony lucked into picking him as the lead composer of The Last of Us, in terms of like someone able to carry the scores from game to TV show and just being such a consummate professional in that? Or do you think it's the other way around? They knew that he was that good at, as an all-round musician, and that's why they hired him?
Well, I think it was Druckmann personally, Last of Us creator. He personally reached out. So again, I think because the Last of Us games are those ones where you've got a creative director with a clear vision who knows what they want, he reached out to him directly. I imagine from what Matthias was telling me about Game Music Festival and just pulling that together, I imagine it was very much a vibing process where you've got to remember, like, he's not familiar, he is in Gustavo, he's not familiar with video games. So I imagine there's quite a lot of him sitting down with Neil kind of explaining his journey for the game, figuring out that soundscape, and man, has it pulled off, like, because yes, there were those songs which had the iconic Last of Us melody, that motif, the da 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 da.
Beautiful, Matt.
Everything else in between, in terms of like the battle music, where the Gustavo's just blowing down PVC pipes, which were just sourced before the show by the Game Music Festival crew, while jumping around on like 7 or 8 different stringed instruments, guitars, but then also singing where he basically almost doesn't need the microphone because his voice carries that well.
Oh, it was amazing, yeah.
Dominic was like sat in front of me, Dom Peppiat, and like they just turned round and like laughed audibly. And I think a couple of us did as well when he started singing, because we were just like, none of us expected that kind of voice. And yeah, still even talking about it now, I've like got goosebumps slightly because I just really wasn't expecting that.
And I must admit, I did shed a tear during the, I think the piece is called All Gone on the soundtrack. It's kind of the famous sad cue. And that really got to me because I lost someone in my family recently. And it's just the nature of the music kind of really brings that kind of memory back to you. But how was the rest of the day, Matt? How was the panel in the afternoon, the VO panel, and the Baldur's Gate concert?
Rest of the day was really good. The actors panel was really good. Got off to a bit of a weird start where I think the panel or master class even was marketed as meet the voice actors from Baldur's Gate 3, but they were very much, we are not voice actors, we're actors. And then there was a little bit of awkwardness, I think, with language around the start of it. But after that, it was just hilarious. Like, the entire cast were great. I was at the bar and just saw the actor who plays Raphael next to me, who got up on stage with the Baldur's Gate 3 composer and the rest of the orchestra and did this musical number from the game. So you haven't played Baldur's Gate 3, but the best way to explain it is, do you know how Alan Wake 2 has that huge musical moment?
Yeah.
Baldur's Gate 3 has the equivalent of that, where you've got part musical, part major battle thing going on. And it's with one of the main characters kind of narrating what's happening. Raphael stood next to me and I just go, Raphael, this is going to sound really weird, but can I do a Jaeger bomb with you, please? He was like, yes, of course. It'd be rude not to. And I was like, yeah, like most poshly spoken guy ever, absolute legend. Then I saw Halcyon as well from Baldur's Gate 3. So I just made it my mission for the rest of the night. I'm just going to do shots, basically, with the cast from Baldur's Gate 3. And everybody was lovely. But I think everybody just gathering in that room at the end of the night as well and just sharing stories about how much of an amazing concert it was.
I'm very glad to hear that the day went well. I hope the organisers had a good day and didn't have any emergency headaches. I'm sure there were some, but inevitably. But really look forward to the next one.
What would you like to see them do next? Because I think the thing that I certainly love about Game Music Festival is they will choose IPs that you're not necessarily expecting. Do you know what I mean? Baldur's Gate 3, yes, that does sound like your traditional video game concert. So I loved it, but I feel like me and you have been to a lot of concerts like that before. The Last of Us, I've never experienced something like that, where you've got a guy essentially riffing on stage who just happens to have an orchestra behind him. And obviously before there was Cuphead with the jazz ensemble. So what do you think they'll do next, or what do you think they should do next?
I would really like to see an electronic music performance, and Tunic would probably be top of my list for that, because the vibes are immaculate.
That's a good one.
As we keep saying over and over again. How about you?
I think I'd agree. I'd say something like Streets of Rage making a return, maybe with an orchestra. I'm not sure if you've seen those like 90s revivals they do at the moment, where it's like 90s dance music with an orchestra behind it. That would be really cool.
How about Neon White?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm surprised they've not done Neon White already. But I imagine the licensing for that, and then the people you'd be able to get in a room wouldn't be worth but I can't imagine the licensing would be that much, because it's still an indie game. So yeah, you know what? I'd rather see a Neon White thing than Streets of Rage. I've seen Streets of Rage. Neon White, if you are listening, there's anyone there who can make it happen, make it happen. If no one turns up, I'll still be there. Like, just do it.
Okay, on to the news now. A few bits and bobs. I spotted this Scarlet Moon release. Scarlet Moon is a record label, among other things, and it's called Canvas City, and it has various arrangers and composers on it, including Dale North and a couple of others. And the fun thing about it is it's based on the Sound Canvas, which is like a sample unit, as far as I understand, with different, various different sample sounds on it that then you patch through a keyboard and use to make music. And I think it basically harkening back to the sound of the mid-90s, like cheesy keyboard sounds that people are very, very fond of. And this is a set of musicians who are just very, very fond of that era. So yeah, check that out. It's called Canvas City. It's on all platforms, I believe. But as ever, give them a shout on Bandcamp.
And then I'm not sure if you've seen this, and honestly, I am not going to do the story justice. This is something where check out the episode description afterwards, read the full story via time extension. So, Tom, we've spoken a lot before about kind of false DMCA takedowns on video game music, and there's a lot of chancers out there who will try and do takedowns or monetize videos that aren't theirs. This is what's happened to two video game soundtracks for like the most obscure releases ever, like Metal Orange EX on the X68000, which is a banging PC, by the way, with some fantastic like J-pop game soundtracks, and Chip Chant Kick on the PC FX. So basically, Very OK Vinyl and Disc Union recently announced that they're collaborating with the original composers to release those soundtracks for both games. These releases will enable the original artists to benefit from the commercial sale of the music they created. The problem is, there is an individual called Yusuf Dalmaz, a representative of Metro VG, a firm which apparently manages a catalogue of music penned by his father, who, it is claimed, was a resident in Japan in 1990s and wrote video game music under pseudonyms. Apparently people are just calling this out and saying this is not true, you do not own the rights, you've been chancing loads of other game soundtracks doing the exact same thing. All of these other uploaders of video game music have the receipts, stop it. But the problem is, as we both know, many Japanese game composers have little interest in safeguarding the music they produced decades ago, and as a result, it gets exploited by individuals like Dalmaz. So again, if you want to learn more about this story, check out the link in the episode description via time extension. It is absolute madness.
Another quick one from me. I spotted that there's going to be an online concert to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Mother, aka Earthbound. Actually, Mother 1 to 3, I think. That'll be on June 22nd in Japan, and international viewers can purchase a streaming ticket for around $19. And legendary Nintendo composer Hirokazu Hip Tanaka will be there. I think there's like 3 parts of the concert. He'll be doing something to do with the first part, and then there'll be a Q&A with the original composer, and then Keiichi Suzuki, the composer, will do something with the third part of the concert. So yes, do check that out if you're interested. That'll be on June 22nd. We'll drop a link in the show description.
So this was a really interesting story that I found in a local news publication in America about a local musician who just happened to be discovered by a production company who works with Fortnite on their music after this artist posted on Reddit. So this is an alternative hip-hop artist called Why Try, who at the beginning of 2023 started posting videos of his music on Reddit. According to WBUR, he did a series called Video Games My Song Should Be In, where he'd dress up as different characters from games and just play along with the music. Those games included Madden, Resident Evil, and Cyberpunk. The first 2 videos did pretty well, but subsequent videos captured the attention of a company who works with Epic, which led to him working on lobby music for Fortnite. So for some quick context there, every time Fortnite launches a new season, that also comes with like a season theme song. And some of these lobby songs actually feature really big artists. So as an example, the one that this guy's done also features a performer from the metal band Periphery, who are like a really, really big metal band. The underworld king, try to run your escape, cold, hard, even if dark arts. Can't wait till the day you depart, and this darkness written in the stars. Through the air, getting cold, dark. If you want to hear all of these Fortnite lobby songs, and honestly I'd recommend checking these out because I was not aware of these, but some of them are like really, really good. Cover all different genres of music, from hip-hop to pop to rap to metal. There is a link to a Kotaku article where they rank all 50 Fortnite lobby tracks at the time of writing, so check that out.
My interviewee this week is Jamie Mac Rae, who is Vice President of Business Development at Materia Music, or Materia Collective, as a lot of people know them as, is a video game record label. It's a music publisher, and it's a rights administrator, among other things. Our aim was to focus specifically on indie game soundtracks and what the opportunities might be around those for composers, for game developers, and for basically anyone involved in the creation of that music. Are you a music first person or a video games first person in terms of your background and your passions and your career so far?
That's a tough question because they're both so intertwined for me. I guess I would say a music first person, but I grew up on video games. My involvement with video games was definitely before my involvement in music. I had my first Game Boy Color when I was not even. I had a Game Boy Pocket when I was maybe like 5, and started playing with that. Played video games ever since. But music has definitely become kind of my principal passion. On the side of this job, I also DJ. I run a DJ collective. So that's just like an extra side thing. So really, like, music is probably my central focus on the day-to-day, especially now. Things are a little different for me because with me just being a busier adult in general, I don't have as much energy to devote to music as I'd like.
Oh, I know that feeling very, very well. We sound quite similar, actually.
Yeah. You know, once upon a time, I played guitar, I played piano. These days, I don't really do that anymore. I just kind of DJ. But, you know, I still make time for games. But for me, you know how there's a thing with like older people where they just keep listening to the same music they listened to when they were teenagers?
Yeah.
I'm kind of like that with games, where like I'll return to the same handful of games over and over again. You know, I like From Software games. I like, you know, Dead by Daylight, a couple other key games here and there.
Are you like me that in music, actually, because we both work for record labels, you try and keep your ears maybe more open and your mind more open to different types of music because it feels like work in that sense, in a good way, in like an exploratory way?
Absolutely. I do not want to become like the stodgy old critic who only listens to old music and never embraces anything new. I mean, really getting into DJing for me was a huge like departure because I grew up listening to like alternative and rock and emo, and you know, I never really had a background in EDM, and once I kind of discovered more of that, I embraced it. But that doesn't mean that, you know, I don't want to listen to other kinds of music. I actually just started digging into like Elvis Presley's back catalog, and I'm really enjoying that a lot right now. And yeah, I mean, I'm always willing to listen to any new music, and I think it's very important to like have the self-awareness to not fall into the trap of just listening to the same 10 records every day.
Did you always think that you wanted to come to the intersection of music and games, or is like there must have been something that you were generally trying to move towards, or when you saw the opportunity, like leap towards? Is that how it went?
Yeah, I absolutely never thought I was going to wind up in this sector because I never thought it was a sector that would really exist. It seemed too good to be true. So I initially went to college thinking that I was going to go into writing and animation.
Ah, okay.
And that was like my big thing. Like freshman year of college, I tried to take some writing classes and some animation classes. I took one animation class and immediately was like, this is not for me. I do not have the chops for this. I just didn't have the innate, you know, what it took. So I was searching for other things, and thankfully I was young enough that pivoting was still quite easy. I've always loved music and was like, okay, well, what is getting into the music industry really look like? And thankfully I lived in New York. So, you know, plenty of music industry access in that city, you know, plenty of internship opportunities and stuff like that. So, you know, I looked into, you know, what the options were and said, what the hell? I'm going to take a leap for it. And I found a lot more success there. I had great internships. I found it very fascinating. I learned a lot about the framework of the industry and what it's like to work in the music business. And I had my first job out of college at Sony Music, which that took a while. Like I had to hustle for a straight year doing like part-time side gigs and just like networking to try to land that job. Finally did. The pay was absolutely abhorrent. It helped me like get a foot in the door and start to meet people and network. When I was there, we were just seeing some of the very first license IP requests come in for people trying to put video game soundtracks out on vinyl, which at the time was like totally unheard of. Nobody at Sony had any idea why anybody would want to do this, but they said, hey, whatever, you know, it's money, it's a licensing deal, sure. So, you know, we were producing like The Last of Us with Mondo, Mother with Ship to Shore, some stuff like that. And that's when I really started to take a notice of like, oh, this is a rising sector. This is going to be the next huge. I immediately was like, this is going to become a massive land grab in the next 5 years, which it did. Absolutely. And I also immediately identified that anime was going to be next, which we're seeing right now. Like right now, as of this recording, like we are very much in the early stages of the genesis of anime vinyl. I would say anime now is where video games were in like 2016.
Yeah, I mean, that was nascent time, 2016. That's when Laced did the Hotline Miami and got started. So you think that's the next boom?
Absolutely. There's no question. There's so much anime back catalog that hasn't been done yet or explored. The only big profile releases we've even seen so far are like some Toei back issues, that are just like a completely safe bet, and then like a few other curated individual releases here and there. But there's so much catalog that people would absolutely pay for based on the novelty of it being anime music that I think like the video game music industry, like the consumer base has moved on. Circa 2015, 2016, people would buy video game vinyl just because it's video game vinyl. These days, the market is way more saturated. Consumers are kind of over that mentality. You know, people will still obviously buy it. That's why we make it. But it's more of a concerted, like, I'm buying this because I love the music or I love the franchise. I think the collector who is just buying everything video game vinyl is a dying breed.
Yeah, because it's so expensive. I've talked to some of them, yeah.
It's not only really expensive, there's just so much of it.
And yeah, storing it. Like we had Freddie Lauridsen, who goes by Blip Blop, who's a sort of community leader in the collector's world. And I remember chatting to him in the pub 5-6 years ago, and at that point he didn't have children and he had enough shelf space, and I can tell you for a fact he does not have any enough shelf space anymore, and certainly not with a kid around. So yeah, it's been difficult for the super collectors to keep up. They've had to become a lot more discerning. If you were at Sony and you were thinking about video game soundtrack releases, or you were seeing them come by like The Last of Us, I mean, that's the most AAA of AAA, really. That's a Sony first-party game that did incredibly well. When did you start to think or notice that the indie game soundtracks might have something about them in terms of all of the things that could potentially be done with them, but also just in terms of attracting a large fan base, and sometimes an even bigger fan base than people who played that particular indie game? My
biases here are obviously apparent, but I do think it all really started with Undertale, because Undertale was, like, from what I had seen in my own personal experience and career, Undertale was the first indie game to take off the way it did, not just because it was an indie darling game, but because of the soundtrack specifically. It was very obvious, and I wasn't involved with Materia back then, but it was very obvious, even looking on from afar, like, oh, this is going to go places. It was quite clear that fans were all about the music and covering it and remixing it and using it and playing it and listening to it, and I knew that any Undertale musical product was going to see success, and it has. It also really goes to show, like, the power of the internet and word of mouth and that sort of very hardcore fan base of players who will lovingly spread the gospel of whatever game they're latched onto. And Undertale just really fostered this community and kind of still stands as a beacon on the hill to all other indie games of, like, you know, this is what success looks like at the highest level for an indie title.
It is an extraordinary story for that game. There's been big indie game soundtracks before that, but you know, Fez, Hotline Miami, that kind of stretch from, I guess, 2000 and somewhere between 2008 2012, when the golden age of indie games, air quotes, started. Yeah, and then I always, as well as name checking Undertale, I always immediately think of Celeste. I think of Stardew Valley, Hollow Knight. So there is an S tier, really, isn't there, of soundtracks that have just, the community just takes them and keeps them afloat. Those soundtracks live beyond the game and they just carry on going. Like, covers keep coming out, cover albums keep coming out. What drives that for the community? What have they latched onto that means that they can keep these things going long since the composer or even the creator of the game I would assume that they would have thought the lifespan of it would be?
I mean, I really think you hit the nail on the head with the idea that the music outlives the game. And that's something that we talk about all the time when we're talking to, like, different composers and rights holders, stuff like that. We talk about how, you know, having your music set up correctly puts in place the foundation of a legacy that will extend years beyond people actually playing the game. And I think that what the audience latches onto is that the music allows them in some way to relive the connection they have with the game without having to actually go and take the time to play it again.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's one word, isn't it? It's just vibes.
It is just vibes. Every Spotify playlist would agree. It's just vibes.
There's something about that connection, that vibes connection between the time that a fan played the game first and then the time they loaded it into their music, the digital music library, or bought the vinyl and revisit it when they're in a particular mood, and can end up, I guess, listening to the soundtrack if they've got it on repeat, if they listen to it in the background while they work, if they've got a big playlist or something, they can end up spending a lot more time with the music than they ever did with the game. Just talk a bit more about what you say to some of the video game developers or some of the publishers or composers you might talk to, and how to frame the soundtrack in their minds. What should they be thinking about even before it's being finished?
So something that's key to understanding the importance of game soundtracks is just understanding fundamentally that a gamer's relationship with that music is very different to any other kind of media that exists, because it's deeply connected to a mechanical experience that the player is having. You're not watching a movie or reading a book or listening to music. It's not just a passive experience. You are playing a game. So all the triumphs, all the tribulations, all the highs and lows of that experience, you are feeling those emotions in conjunction with music that allows you to relive an element of your own past. And that comes through in the soundtrack and a person's relationship to it. That's really not something that we get from any other type of media. And also, more importantly, you are spending much more time with it on average. So, if you're playing a game for 50 hours, 100 hours, that soundtrack is with you the whole time. A movie at most is 2 to 3 hours. So, a game is really going to live and dig in your ears for a much longer period of time. So that connection just gets hard written into your brain. And having that to tap into by having your music be available to people is such a strong way of keeping that connection alive. And that's why it's important to set up your music correctly and have it be available.
What's goal number one in terms of utilizing this music?
So you need, if you're smart enough and savvy enough and in a good enough position to be ahead of the game, and it's pre-launch day and you're just thinking about launch strategy, make sure your music is available everywhere on day one. The day the game comes out, people should be able to stream the soundtrack on Spotify, stream it on Apple, on Amazon, listen to it on YouTube. Depending on the scale of the game, if they can buy the soundtrack on Bandcamp, great. Or whatever other digital download marketplace you might be interested in hosting in. Make it accessible, because fans are going to be hungry for all of the content related to something that they are excited about. They're going to want merchandise. They're going to want to buy physical copies of the game. They're going to want to listen to the music. Everything they can get. There's just this hunger in a fan who just started to experience this exciting new game. So have it available. Also, make sure that all of the music publishing stuff is set up. So what I mean by that is your compositions for the music should be registered with a PRO. You should have full credits everywhere for composers. This is actually something I want to drill into the ear of every composer. Fight for your right for credit. One of the worst things that we see in the industry that really makes me sad is when you go onto a service like Spotify and you pull up a game soundtrack and it's just credited to game soundtrack sound team. And none of the composers get credited, none of the musicians get credited, because not only does that undermine the ability of the composers and musicians to collect royalties based on that, because those credits would be allowing them to collect extra royalties, it just undermines the career. It undermines your ability to point at a game and say, yeah, I worked on that. Look, you can look it up on the service and there's my name on it. Every person should be credited for the work they do, and fighting for that and getting that in place before the game even launches is a really good thing to do. Now, not everybody is in a position to do that. If you're working with a AAA developer, they're probably going to be nah, we're going to do it our way. But you can try, and you should try. For indies specifically, the great thing about being indie is that you have more control over your music. So you are in a much better position to have everything distributed and credited and set up before the game comes out.
So if we've got this deadline of the game's launch, which is, of course, when the press are most likely to be talking about it, it's when most theoretically the largest number of people are going to be thinking about it. Although, of course, there are games like Hollow Knight, Among Us, that a couple of years went by before they reached their peak of kind of notoriety, I guess. We've been chipping away, we've been chiding very, very long soundtrack releases recently, just because for some of the AAA games, they've got, into the hundreds of tracks. And we wonder whether, because you said earlier, fans are hungry. And we know that some fans are hungry for everything that they can possibly wrap their ears around. But the counterpoint is that potentially it might be easier to get someone to listen to your soundtrack if it's beneath, if it's not 60 tracks long on launch. And if it does feel like maybe the composers put some effort into curation, not just mixing and mastering the music for a soundtrack release, which is a big job anyway, but actually saying, I'm going to maybe do just a volume 1 and it's going to have 20 tracks, 12 to 20 tracks, and it's going to be a curated listening experience. If that took a bit longer and pushed the soundtrack past the video game's release, do you find value in that curation, or do you think that specifically for the indie sector, maybe it is better to just whack absolutely every piece of music you've got going out there, within reason, obviously, of quality, but where do you fall on that?
That is such a hard question, because I think this is the worst answer in the world, but I think it depends on the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think some games, there is this expectation that there's going to be a ton of music, right? Like you look at Square Enix games where their Spotify playlist is like 300 tracks long or some craziness like that. And yeah, all that's going to happen there is certain key tracks are going to float to the top. People are going to seek out a specific track, add it to their likes, and then never listen to the rest of the score again. There's a thing where somebody out there is going to want to listen to some little piece that maybe nobody else is. I can't tell you how many times there's been a soundtrack release where there's like an alternate version of a song that was an insert song into a specific scene, maybe like an a cappella piece or whatever. And there's a fan screaming like, please let me listen to that. I want to listen to that so bad. And it's not on the release. So I would say it behooves you to release everything you can, even if it's a bit longer, and just have an understanding, or maybe even curate a playlist separately of like the heavy hitters that people are actually going to want to listen to by and large. But the more music you have available, the more you can leverage that in some way. And there might be unexpected ways. Maybe there's a sad 2-minute long or less violin reprisal of the game's main leitmotif that comes up in a sad scene somewhere. And you said, what the hell, we'll throw it on the playlist in Spotify anyway. Somebody's going to want to listen to it. And what do you know? Somebody used it as UGC background music in a TikTok video, and it went viral. So now you have the structure in place to be prepared for the unexpected. And, you're in a position to take advantage of that. Whereas if you didn't have that music released, well, either that TikTok may have never happened at all, or somebody ripped it from the game and that TikTok is garnering millions of streams and you're getting nothing from it because the music's not released, the music's not registered. So you're better off having everything be out because that also gives you control over what happens.
It's a kind of a business versus creativity problem, isn't it? Because in a perfect world, you'd say, composers have opinions on soundtrack albums and soundtracks and albums in their own right. There's a few composers I know of who are quite careful curators of their stuff, and they would prefer a shorter album that is a better listening album. And there are soundtracks out there where people say, this is a great album unto itself. And they tend to be on the more manageable side in terms of number of tracks. So in a perfect world, a composer would just be able to creatively do whatever they wanted with the material and craft the perfect album. But what you're saying is actually maybe do that through the other mechanisms of playlists and other tools of curation, and then but make the original soundtrack release as complete as possible.
Yeah, I think that's also where something like vinyl comes in, where you can cherry pick the best of the best, put it on a vinyl, and that's the curated listening experience.
And there will still be people who complain that not everything is available.
Until the end of time, but at least you have something that meets in the middle.
Yeah. Are you a fan of the double LP release? Just as that as a a target to curate to that is going to work for most listeners and most kind of creators of soundtracks?
I absolutely am. I definitely prefer a curated double LP more so than a box set. The only game soundtracks I would ever buy a box set for personally are either like absolutely phenomenal scores where I truly need the whole thing, like the cream of the crop, or something where, it's like a game I love dearly. So, looking at the box sets I even have right now on my shelf, all I have are The Last of Us, Sekiro, Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 4, and Valhalla. Those are the only video game box sets I own. And I would be very reticent to buy any more because I think 2 LPs are more affordable, more curated, they cost less money, and they're just overall like way easier to justify for the average customer.
Anyone just has to look at Laced Records' release schedule to know where our head's at, which is that we just did, for instance, Monster Hunter World and Tekken 8, and in both cases we had a big box set. Monster Hunter was like 6 LPs, Tekken 8 was 5 LPs, and then in both cases we have a 2 LP version as well, because it's not that much more extra work and to create it, because we use the same art assets and things. You just sort of have to change the packaging a little bit, and it just feels good to offer something at the lower price point for someone who doesn't need every single tiny sting and bit of incidental music. So if you're talking to an indie game, a composer in general, if they're still at that nascent stage, they're still sort of finishing off the soundtrack or whatever, the game is yet to release. For you, is vinyl an aspiration, or is it something that any composer could probably manage? It just depends how maybe they're willing to get their hands dirty.
I think it is more of an aspiration because I think that there needs to be a certain level of self-awareness regarding the business side of it, not only in terms of like the actual logistics of getting it manufactured, shipping, fulfillment, accounting, royalty collection, all that, but more importantly, just from like a basic business standpoint, you're not going to get a decent record made for less than 300 units. So if you don't think there's a really strong chance that you can sell 300 units of a record, you're better off not making it. At the very most, I would say do like a CD release or something limited or curated like that, because they're cheaper, they're easier to make, they're smaller, and that can be your nice physical package if you really want to go physical. But vinyl is expensive, it's big, the shipping logistics are a lot more difficult, it's more sensitive. There's a reason the music industry moved away from it when CDs and cassettes came out. So you just got to be realistic with yourself about like, will this make me a return on my investment? Not even money, because a lot of people are not doing it for just money purposes. They're doing it for like the emotional purpose and the fun of it. But just, can I make enough that this is worth it?
So what I'm hearing from you, Jamie, is mini discs.
No. never ever. We've done one mini disc and it will be the last mini disc.
Yeah, we've done one as well.
It's such a pain.
So that's really interesting, and of course it's always worth bearing in mind that vinyl is it's a long-term game. Like it takes a long time to set it up, it takes a long time to actually get it to customers, etc., etc. So if a game might not launch with enough fuss to warrant a vinyl. But if that picks up steam, if the game gets a cult status, if the soundtrack really, really takes off and something else could happen down the line to make it something that's sought after, there's always the potential to revisit it on vinyl at a later point, if that IP is gonna really pick up. And ultimately, do you advise people, or in your heart of hearts, do you think that it's the game that needs to do well? The game needs to have the vibes and to really connect with fans if a soundtrack's going to do really well and potentially sell 300 plus vinyl?
Yes, that is, it's unfortunate. Like, I do hate to say it because there's a lot of games that fly under the radar with some absolutely beautiful music. but the success of game music is directly proportional to the success of the game. There are probably rare instances here and there where that's not quite true that I'm forgetting about, maybe like cult soundtracks like Patapon or Loco Roco or whatever. But for the most part, yeah, there's a direct correlation. So you have to bear that in mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. It is a sad thing. There are lots of wonderful soundtracks for smaller games where the game didn't. I mean, the indie game sector is a risky business, isn't it? Like, there's so much that can go wrong if it's an online game. The servers can fall over day one. You can have a rough, bugs, or something embarrassing comes out about one of the dev team, or just anything can go wrong around release time that can kind of slightly torpedo the success of an indie game. And sadly, you could have made the greatest soundtrack of all time, and the chances of lots of people hearing it dwindle as the chances of the game finding success dwindle. That is the sad reality. But let's say now we take our composer, our developer, and things are going well. The game's launched well. The soundtrack seems to be well received, critically, and people really like it. What are some of the other opportunities then that come into play for composers who've worked on indie games?
So a big one that a lot of people don't think about is sheet music. Sheet music is a really, really great opportunity because, for one thing, it fosters an ecosystem where people have a much easier time covering your music. And covers of music help continue to keep the interest in that music alive because it's just another new, fun way people are experiencing older music. So finding a partner who can work with you to get sheet music put out is definitely something that, for the right score, is valuable.
What are some titles that have sheet music that have done well that you know of?
I mean, not to sit here and plug my own catalog, but we do very well with it. We have Undertale, Celeste, Hollow Knight. Those have all done very well. There's definitely more to come. We've got a lot revving in the oven right now at Materia Editions. That's going to be huge for me this year. But there haven't really been a lot of sheet music opportunities in gaming that have been exploited traditionally, and I think that that's to the industry's detriment. I'm even trying to call upon mental examples of AAA games that have like a sheet music book that everyone has bought, but I really can't think of any.
No, there's the Final Fantasy piano collections will have sold a lot of sheet music, but not the original compositions necessarily.
You know what? Also, now I'm thinking about Nier. Nier has had a few, and those have done well. But, that's very specifically Square Enix, because Square Enix does very much understand the value of its musical catalog, and those tend to only be released in Japan, so you have to import them.
Yes, yeah.
Having global launches for your sheet music is very important. And aside from that, I mean, there's a few standout companies in the industry, not just in the indie space, that understand the value of their music catalog. I would point directly at, Platinum Games, Square Enix, Riot, stuff like that, companies like that. And even they don't always do sheet music products. So it's such an underserved piece of the market.
Absolutely. I really like that point about you are encouraging and making it easier for cover artists to get involved with your soundtrack. I mean, number one, how important are cover artists these days to the sort of ongoing success of a soundtrack? And number two, is there anything else apart from sheet music that a composer can do to foster that? I don't know, like off the top of my head, like stems or reaching out to some of the big cover artists. What do you have in mind in that sense?
Those are all good ideas.
Okay.
Honestly, yeah, reaching out to some big cover artists and saying like, hey, here's a high-res wave of my song. If you like it, please feel free to cover it. That's a great place to be. Releasing stems. There are, and I say all this with the caveat of like, doing this after you've had your music publishing set up is the way to go so that you can properly collect royalties off of all these things. But like releasing your stems through sites like I think Beatport and some other like DJ focused sites do have music stem marketplaces. But like doing that and encouraging people to remix your music is definitely a great way to keep your music alive for a long time. A great example of this, and this is actually not in the game space, it's in the VTuber space, but that's such an ancillary industry right now. Back in 2020, very popular HoloLive VTuber named Mori Calliope released a song called Please Excuse Me, Rest in Peace, or something like that. It's a Japanese title. But anyway, Please Excuse Me, RIP is kind of what the fans refer to it as. And that song was very, very popular. Like, that was chart topping, the Japanese hip hop charts or whatever. And she held a remix contest where she released the stems and was like, use the stems, remix the song, enter it into a contest. And like, for the next 18 months, people were just cranking out remixes and covers of that song over and over and over again. And all of those ancillary pieces of music drive interest back to the original. Because if somebody hears the remix from an artist they like, but they haven't heard the original, they're going to go check it out. And thanks to that, that song racked up hundreds of millions of streams.
It's so important, isn't it, to make sure that you both control and take advantage of your copyright. But in the video game space, we know there's a special exception, because if you are too controlling of it, you could accidentally, the music can hurt the game's popularity on streaming sites, on Twitch and YouTube.
Yeah, so if I could distill all of my industry wisdom down to a single bit for an indie composer, indie developer, what have you, understand that releasing the music itself, whether on Bandcamp or on vinyl or what have you, is not the goal. It's the starting line. What you want to be doing is laying the foundations for your music to have a legacy that outlives the life of the game. You want to create an ecosystem where fans can and will engage your music years after they've stopped playing the game itself, and they will. We have seen examples of it left and right. So the way to do that is to get your music publishing set up, work with a distribution partner, work with a PRO, performance rights organization, do some research into what those are, and have your music set up in a way where you have control over allowing or not allowing people to use your music in the right way, but you can benefit from it. The idea of having control is not to stop people from doing cool things. It's to allow people to do cool things in a way that you both mutually benefit.
We've seen a lot of video game concerts, live performances. Is there much you like to add on that front? Like, what can everyone involved with indie soundtracks do to kind of foster that area? And is that maybe still a bit nascent when it comes to indie games? We have seen live performances based around indie games, and there are some conventions and things, but generally speaking, when you see big ticket concerts, it's built around the big gaming IP, like a Pokemon, a Zelda, Final Fantasy, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts on the live performance world, which is, of course, connected to covers, I guess?
It's definitely a fantastic opportunity for a lot of composers and a lot of games. It's also very difficult because live music is probably the most risky part of the entire music business. And because of that, promoters are typically not interested in engaging with music that doesn't already have a very significant proven track record. So even in the indie scale right now, if you look at the indie games that are getting performed at live events, it's only like the absolute most popular. It's Celeste, Undertale, Hollow Knight,
Cuphead, yeah.
Maybe Cocoon these days after it's won all the awards. Things like that, where it's like practically a household name, the kind of game that's so popular you're not even sure it's indie anymore. That's the kind of stuff where people are performing it live. Do I think there can and should be better representation for indie music and live music spaces? Yes. Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities to do that at a grassroots level. Go to MagFest, do a little concert of your music at one of those shows. Try to set up stuff online, have a quartet or a chamber perform your music for you on like a Twitch stream or something. Like there's ways you can be savvy about a grassroots approach to live music that doesn't involve trying to sell out Carnegie Hall. But just understand that the average concert promoter is very skeptical of touching anything that they don't think will like guarantee them, a 75% venue seat fulfillment sale of tickets.
In terms of the actual video game developers, the development team, and, they may or may not be large enough to have a publisher, and the publisher may or may not be large enough to have lawyers. But what would you say to game developers and, publishers of smaller titles in terms of the opportunities around indie game soundtracks, but also what approach you would like to see them take to, and again, it's that kind of, like with copyright, like control, but also embracing those opportunities. How would you prefer developers and publishers, the people responsible for the sort of media rights of the overall IP, to think about music?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm really glad you asked it, because there's some very good bits of advice. Number one, recognize that your music is not only a powerful evergreen asset on its own. It's something that can keep making money even after the game no longer is. But even in the earliest nascent stages of a game's life cycle, it is a valuable marketing asset. The game generates interest in the music, and the music will generate interest in the game. Use your game's soundtrack as part of your marketing mix. UGC content, sneak previews, making of content, give people a little peek behind the hood of what it looks like sitting in the studio in front of a 50-channel mixer recording an orchestra for your game. These things are very interesting to fans, and, it's a great way of leveraging an asset you already have for more marketing purposes.
So I'm led to understand as well that kind of thing helps with awards and like award panels and judges, like behind the scenes footage and like mini docs and things like that do help build a case if you're lucky to be able to submit music to awards.
Yeah, because it builds prestige value, right? If you can, like one example that always comes to mind, unfortunately, again on the AAA level. Sony has a video on their channel somewhere of like the recording of the Cleric Beast theme from Bloodborne. And it's like a beautifully shot, great cinematography, just scene of like all the people in the choir singing the song. And like, as a fan, like you like recognize it. Like it's this crazy moment of like this music you've only heard in the context of being in the background of a game, and now you're seeing actual human beings perform it. Like, that's really engaging, and that sort of thing will just drive a lot of interest into the IP.
So for a start, you've got to be able to afford an orchestra, and then you've got to be able to get the video crew and edit it all together and get it out there. So come across a good example of like on a much, much lower budget or much, much lower scale of a composer or a development team who have done well to kind of promote the making of the soundtrack to fans that's been quite effective for you?
Yes. And something I would talk to composers about, which is not what a lot of people like to hear, but a very successful strategy is becoming an internet personality. So having a social media presence, streaming on Twitch, streaming on YouTube. People love to be like, oh, my favorite games composer is going to do a stream where he breaks down the making of a soundtrack, or he's going to do a live remix or performance of a game I like. People will tune into that. And that just continues to drive music not only toward the game, or interest rather, driving interest toward not only the game and the music, but like the composer as a person, which helps in their career, because if a composer specifically has a big following, game companies know that they can use that as an extra selling point for the game.
It is hard to hear, because I can already hear a million composers screaming out in vain saying, yeah, but I'm not a music artist, I'm not a celebrity, I already have enough trouble staying on top of my, updating my VSTs to then have to do LinkedIn and YouTube and blah, 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 and all the extra work. And that is the sad fact that to be a creative at that end of the industry is just a ton of work.
The fact of the matter is, this is a business, And if you want to get ahead of it, you have to treat it like one. You have to understand that. And actually, this is like a little nugget that I preach to every single composer I meet, and I will continue to do so until the end of time. Even if you are a video game composer, understand that your job is not in the video games industry. Your job is in the music industry, and the video game industry is your clientele. You are a composer. You are producing music. Everything that governs how that gets used and how you get paid are music industry rules and regulations. You are a musician.
To take that point further, are you saying that that's how a composer kind of protects their power?
So many composers, and this is a norm in the video game industry, will wind up signing full buyout agreements with the studio, where basically the studio assumes full control of the rights, they assume full control of the assets. The composer no longer owns their music. The music is completely owned by the studio. You're going to have to sign some agreements like this in your career. If you're doing a game soundtrack for Microsoft, guess what? You don't have the negotiating leverage to do anything differently. But if you're working with a smaller studio and you understand how to administrate your own music rights, you can say to a studio, potentially, hey, I'm a composer, I'll make this game for you, or I'll make this music for you, but I want to own the music and give you a license to use it in your game and throughout your IP, and I will administrate the music. I will control, the soundtrack release and stuff like that. Because a lot of game companies sign buyout agreements not because they actually want to do anything with the music, but because it's like a knee-jerk fear reaction. They don't know how to manage music, but they know that if they own everything, they don't really have to, because there's no obligation to do anything to anyone else. And when that happens, it is the composer who loses out, because many opportunities that composer might have had to do something cool with their music are lost because they no longer have the authority to make that decision. So as a composer, you want to try to retain control of your rights as much as possible. And even if that's not the case, try to work with the game studio on music administration, whether that's signing with an external partner. And that's, for the record, just to give some context to my own biases here, that is what I do. Many times I will step into a relationship where a studio says, hey, we own this game soundtrack, we signed a buyout agreement with the composer, we have full rights to it, we really don't know what to do with it. And we will come in and say, okay, we'll take care of all the music publishing admin for you. We'll get it on vinyl. We'll distribute it on the streaming services and blah, blah, blah. You don't have to worry about any of it. We'll handle all the accounting and all the legwork. Working with your game studio as a composer and advocating for that approach is going to help you make sure that your music goes as far as it can.
Yeah, and with that, your profile raises, and with that, you get jobs where you might be able to negotiate a better position. And it's funny because I'm thinking back to examples where a game is really small to start with. It might be a student project, it might be some mates working on the game and they get another mate to do the music, and things aren't put down in writing clearly at the beginning, and then the game blows up. And it only really becomes a problem if the game blows up and people want a piece of the soundtrack. And then things get messy. I mean, presumably that's another essential piece of advice, is try and, as much as you possibly can, even with mates, be on top of that ahead of time.
Yeah, get everything on paper. And as a matter of fact, if you're doing a project with friends, that's where it's the most important to have paperwork that clearly defines everything, because if anything goes wrong, you are untangling a personal relationship. So yeah, in that case, you especially, anytime anybody's oh, no, we'll do a handshake agreement, it's fine. No, it's not fine, because, you're saying that right now because you don't foresee this being a problem down the road. But if it becomes one, it's going to be 10 times worse. Look at situations like the whole Disco Elysium situation, right? Where there's so much gray area about who owns what, and there's ongoing court battles about it. I mean, that's a mess. Don't let yourself get into a mess. Get things on paper to begin with.
Yeah, and I mean, the wider entertainment industry, all of the stuff around the Nirvana the Nevermind cover and the photography rights and stuff like that. There's messes that could come to bite you in 20 years' time, 40 years' time, that it's worth being clear on at the beginning to help the creative collaboration rather than stunt it or kind of smother it. But it's difficult to hear that, I guess, if you're at the beginning of an exciting collaboration and it's just ideas and it's throwing playlists around and mood boards and vibes and it's all vibes and it's like, no, get the vibes in, put the vibes in a contract. Have a pre-vibes contract before it.
Yeah, prenuptial vibe agreement. And as a game composer at any level, AAA or indie, do not be afraid to advocate for yourself when talking to your studio. Most studios will be receptive to efforts to help elevate the soundtrack because that benefits everyone, including you. It's just that a lot of studios don't understand it because they're game developers. They're not music companies. They're not catalog administrators. They're trying to make a video game. So if you go to a video game studio and say, hey, who here knows how to register your compositions with ASCAP, they're all going to look at you like, what the hell is ASCAP?
Yeah.
Having that open line of dialogue with your developer and saying, hey, I would like to help get something in place to get the music handled right. A lot of times, especially at the indie level, they're going to say, yeah, okay, like, what do you got? Like, I don't really understand that, but I'm all ears. I guess if I just had some, like, parting words to any game composers or indie developers out there, you know, the quick, like, okay, what do I do with my game music? Get some music industry 101 basic knowledge of how music rights work and how music publishing works and how copyright works. It's boring, it's legalese, but it's absolutely worth it. Or work with a partner who knows that stuff.
Yes.
You know, there's multiple publishers and partners out there and record labels who understand this and do this for a living. They can help you if you don't want to have to manage this stuff yourself, but it still behooves you to have an understanding of what goes on and how music is properly handled.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Jamie, for joining us on the GXM podcast. And hopefully that will give some people some good advice.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we're going to go on to Done in 60 Seconds now, where we take just 1 minute to recommend something to each other. Usually it's a video game music track. I'm on a mission to introduce some bangers, some more bangers into Matt's life, because traditionally he's the banger king. And Matt is supposed to be going more melodic and bucolic and chilled out for a couple of picks, so that we're role reversal. Matt, I think you're up first. What have you got for me?
I have got the symphonic soundtrack for a puzzle game on the PlayStation 1 released in 1999. It is composed by a guy called Takayuki Hattori, who has also written music for Gundam The Origin, Godzilla Planet of the Monsters, and various other anime and films. The reason I wanted to share this is because this is a full symphonic soundtrack performed with a live orchestra. You can really hear it. Obviously, the PlayStation was able to do that because it's a CD-ROM, but I believe this is one of the earliest examples of an orchestral soundtrack for video games, and it sounds absolutely divine. It sounds like a full-blown RPG score. So this is The First Tide from IQ.
Matt, I think you're bringing the orchestral bangers this time. That is absolutely incredible. It's very, in terms of style, early 20th century, mid 20th century, like post-romantic. It just goes all over the place in terms of key, but it's so interesting. I don't know if I could listen to like a whole album of that, but that track is fantastic. I definitely got to go and check that out. That is a banger of a different order.
I feel like I have done my job well. Thank you. What have you got for me in return?
Okay, so the Zero Escape series has a really, really, really crazy story. It's a series of visual novels with kind of puzzle escape rooms in it, but there's like this interlinking story with some insane twists. The creator is very idiosyncratic. He introduces lots of weird and wonderful ideas throughout each game to basically teach you random trivia as you play. And it's all very anxious and tense and stressful by design. And the composer, Shinji Hozoe, who's been around in the industry for a long time, he's worked on all sorts of different titles. He creates this amazing, like, dense, anxious electronica, and this is a track called Digital Route from the first game, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors.
Sir, fun fact, this is obviously, as you said, Shinji Hozoe. I have heard, I think, every piece of music he's ever written because this guy's a king. You've chosen from this soundtrack, I believe, one of the more pleasant songs.
Yes, that's true.
Because there are some really, like, I was going to say horrendous then, but intense. There are some really dark, almost like Aphex Twin territory songs on this, which are just... So that's what I mean. As someone, I like the fact that I got the summary of the game and the series at the beginning, because when I was looking at it, I was like, I don't understand what this is. Do you know what I mean? When I've listened to the soundtrack separately, I didn't know any information about the game series. So that's interesting to know. I understand why the music is kind of like all over the place now. But yeah, this soundtrack, again, anything Shinji does is just 10 out of 10 stuff.
Does it count as a 3 a.m. banger?
I think it kind of does, yeah, but it's more of a fall into someone's living room who you don't quite know and just start chain smoking spliffs and cigarettes as opposed to carry on the party. Do you know what I mean? This is very much the sun starting to rise. 5 a.m. should we walk down to the offie territory? But it's still a banger.
All right, okay. Well, I'll continue my my banger hunt next time.
There we go.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for on the GXM podcast this time. Thank you so much for joining us at the intersection between video games and music. Please be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, share it with people you know. We're really keen to be heard by people in either industry, video games or music. So please do pass it along. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, at GXM Podcast. You can drop us a line at gxmpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much to 8 Beats Radio for amplifying the show. It's produced by both of us, edited by me, Tom Quillfeldt. Music is by Zach Foster, and show art is by Joshua Klein.